these very hard days since the revolution, maybe we laughed at Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood before that. Maybe we are laughing about so many other things today, but in all cases, we are not laughing simply because we don't respect our rulers or we don't respect our country, but simply because we try to tell them that we are suffering from a void, that you are not doing well enough to fill this void. And when someone come and tell me that he is a leader comparable to Nasser, for example, this is really a funny situation and a funny self-definition. And when someone else come and tell me that he is Gandhi, and he used the word Gandhi, then we must laugh, because he doesn't have the look of Gandhi, he doesn't have the ideas of Gandhi, he did not have the approach of Gandhi, he had nothing of Gandhi to tell us that he is Gandhi. But Egyptians are clever enough to discover those pseudo entities in the void, and they are not able to play the role of attractors, political attractors, cultural attractors, social attractors, economic attractors. We don't have real attractors in the actual Egyptian situation. And this is our crisis of today, that we have so many politicians, so many social reformers, so many cultural reformers, and so on, but actually they are all pseudo entities, pseudo attractors in the language of chaos. How to go out of this chaos when you have all these pseudo attractors who compete with each other? I mean, when a pseudo attractor is competing with another pseudo attractors, believe me, sir, you will laugh for hours when you just contemplate what is happening, what is said from each side to the other side, and we will find so many basic materials, raw materials for caricature and for cartoons, for jokes, for laughing. And as I have said, it is not about irrespect to our rulers or to our country, but it is simply as a way, it's a very civilized way, I think, to say that we suffer. We are in a problem, and we must find a solution. And it is not enough to say that I am Gandhi, to think that we are India, or we are I am Nehru, so we will be as Nehru, or we will find an issue from our crisis simply because someone tells us that he is Nasser or Nehru or Tito or I don't know who else. Okay, I will stop now since Mr. Chairman has a final decision about that. Thank you for your attention.
Very interesting talk by Dr. Hazem Hosni that gave us the background to satire, the political background to satire and cartoons, and related it directly to the present situation in Egypt that we are now going through. I have the pleasure now of opening the floor for questions and answers with our two distinguished speakers. I will take the opportunity, or the advantage rather, of chairing this session to pose the first question to our good friend here and ask him about how he draws politicians and if his drawing of the politician evolves and changes over the years depending on their policies and how he views them. If he starts by being sympathetic to a prime minister? Does he draw him in a certain way, and then when he is disappointed or disillusioned with the same prime minister, does his portrait differ completely? Because he said something very important. He said, you do not draw the person as he looks, but as he ought to look. In other words, he draws the real soul, the personality. And so if his idea, if his attitude and approach to the personality changes, we assume that the personality is the same. But does his cartoon drawings change from one attitude to the other? And has he painted any prime ministers in different ways depending on how he viewed them at different times of their tenure?
Yes, sir. It's a very interesting question, and I must say, when I look at a politician, when somebody becomes prime minister or a major politician in any country, he suddenly comes in the range of the cartoonist brush. In my cartoons, many times I have drawn a politician who is very big in stature, or whom I like a little bit, maybe his politics, as a very tall character. And the present Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh, is a very tiny little character in my cartoons for the last 10 years. And so far as how a cartoon character or a politician evolves, I'll give you an example of my hero number one, Mr. Narasimha Rao, our Prime Minister from 91 to 96. When he became Prime Minister, it was a big challenge for me, as I said, that it would be very difficult for me to draw his cartoons. And I said that within 6 months he converted himself into a first-rate cartoon character. When I started drawing him, my caricature of Mr. Narasimha Rao did not look like him. After a few months, as he evolved as a Prime Minister, and my caricature also alongside was evolving, my caricature of Mr. Narasimha Rao started looking exactly like him. My cartoon and Mr. Narasimha Rao started looking like clones, Long Locks brothers. And there came a time when my caricature of Mr. Narasimha Rao started looking more like him than he himself did. And that is the beauty of a caricature, when the caricature starts representing the politician. And I often say that a caricature truly portrays and represents a politician than his photographs in newspapers. And the question was, if I like a politician or if I hate a politician, does it change? It doesn't change, because I hate all politicians.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sudhir Thailand. I now open the floor to our good audience. If there are any questions or remarks or comments that you would like to make. Yes? تفضل.
مرحبا. نجاح سفر صحفية حرة. معلش أنا بس بدي أقول شغلة خارج اللي حاصل. أنا حاسة حالي بأوروبا الأمم المتحدة مثلا، أو أمريكا أو بريطانيا. يعني نحن عرب ولغتنا عربية، ما بعرف ليش مصرين كلنا نحكي بالإنجليزي.
عندك سؤال للضيوف لو سمحتي؟
لا بس هي ملاحظة.
لا، غير مسموح بملاحظات انتقاد من ضيفة جاية تحضر مناسبة ثقافية.
لا بس هي
أمامنا ضيفين، توجهي سؤال لهم أو تستمعي إليه.
بس هي لأنه استغربت.
شكرا جزيلا. اللي بعده، نحن لسنا متعصبون ولدينا ضيوف ونحاول أن نتحدث إليهم بلغتهم، وهذه كرامة الضيافة العربية.
See, religion is a very tricky subject.
Where do you draw the line?
I'm saying that religion is a very tricky subject. The moment you touch religion, you are inviting trouble. And this has happened over the time, many times. You remember the Swedish cartoonists who drew cartoons on Prophet Muhammad? They got into trouble. I think they still have security guards and they can't get out of their house or office. There have been bomb blasts in their office also. I've been to their office, the magazine called Charlie Hebdo in France. They also supported these cartoonists. And India also, I feel that religion is one subject which we avoid consciously. I avoid doing cartoons on, I think this is the worst kind of censorship when you start censoring your cartoons yourself. But let me admit it that religion is one subject which I censor. The reason is you can't invite trouble because your office will be burnt. Somebody will come and burn your office, you'll get into trouble. So I want to draw cartoons and I want my newspaper to function.
Yes?
So freedom of expression has limits.
It is limited so far as religion is concerned, because you can't deal with extremists anywhere in the world. They don't understand the language of cartoonists, they understand the language of the gun. I believe that my brush is more powerful than the gun, but when they come with the gun, I'm helpless. And let me tell you, that for 6 months in India, I had a gunman to protect me because some terrorist organization wanted to kill me. And I got a telephone call from the police commissioner that somebody wants to kill you. So we would like to give you a policeman, a gunman to protect you. For 6 months, he was with me. But the problem with this guy was that he would be sitting with a gun in my car. I was driving to my office and he will fall asleep. So I'll tell him, I used to tell him that, please wake up, somebody would kill you. And in my office, in the evening when I had to go out of my office for my home, I would look for him and he's disappeared. And I asked my peon, where is my security guard? He says, he's watching World Cup cricket downstairs. So I wrote a letter to the police commissioner that if you give me the security guard, even for a single day, I will charge a salary to protect him.
Well, on this happy note,
اي حد يحب يتكلم بالعربي او الانجليزي مفيش مشكله لان عندنا ترجمه موجوده. فارجو انه ما نعتبرش ان دي باي حال من الاحوال عائق على ان احنا يبقى في تفاعل. طيب اسمحوا لي، انا اسمي امنيه حلمي، my name is امنيه حلمي. انا هدي مقدمه صغيره. I'll deliver an introduction for our panelists. Then we'll open the floor for interaction. So. Our guest of honor, Miss Urvashi Butalia, Professor Sahar El-Mogi, His Excellency Ambassador Navdeep Suri, Ambassador of the Republic of India in Egypt, Professor Saeed Tawfiq, Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Culture, ladies and gentlemen, on the occasion of India's Festival for Culture and Arts, India by the Nile, we have the pleasure to host Miss Urvashi Butalia, the famous writer, dignitary and feminist, among many other things. Ms. Butalia is a historian, director and co-founders of the first feminist publishing house in India in 1984, known as Kali for Women, followed by Zuban Books. Ms. Butalia is a consultant in Oxfam, India, and holds the position of reader at the College of Vocational Studies at the University of Delhi. In 2011, she was jointly conferred the Padma Shri Award by the Government of India with Ritu Menon for her contribution to the nation. On the other hand, we have the pleasure also to have Professor Sahar El-Mogi, the Egyptian professor of English poetry in the Faculty of Arts at Cairo University in Egypt. Professor El-Mogi is also a writer and dignitary concerned with human and citizenship rights of women. In 2009, she established a feminist writing workshop called I Am the Story Ana Al-Hikaya, aiming at modifying the women's stereotyping in the media and to discuss gender issues. A true Egyptian role model to many generations to come in Egypt. Two great figures in our societies in the contemporary history of women strife are today sharing with us their life experience towards materializing social peace through gender parity in countries where deep-rooted culture of discrimination of women still exists. I would like to welcome both of our panelists and invite Ms. Urvashi Butalia to take the floor to address our guests.
Thank you very much, Omia. Thank you everybody for being here. I want to start by reminding you all of a story that I'm sure that all the Egyptians here are familiar with. of a woman called Huda Shahravi, who many years ago, on returning to Egypt from Europe, cast her veil upon the ocean, in a way rejecting the oppression of patriarchy. And perhaps you may not know this or be aware of it, but she has been a continuing inspiration to many of us in other parts of the so-called developing world. And very many people in India, very many feminists in India are familiar with her story. I'm delighted to be here. I'm actually a publisher and sometimes a writer. I publish books by and about women. And I've long been involved in the women's movement in India, which is a strong and dynamic and extremely diverse movement, which has given our government quite a hard time over the many years that it has been active in demanding all sorts of changes and in succeeding in securing some of them, but not all of them. My own work is really to look at how knowledge created by women can work in advancing the cause of women's rights and can work, I use the word within quotes, as a weapon in the struggle for women's emancipation. And it's very important in doing that we create knowledge about ourselves, because the flow of knowledge in the world is also such a historically skewed flow in which we are always at the receiving end of knowledge about ourselves, and that knowledge often comes to us from Western countries at hugely expensive prices. So for me, the work of being a feminist publisher in a country like India is the political enterprise not only of creating knowledge about women, but also reversing the flow of information, of knowledge that takes place almost always in one direction, and of building linkages with other women in women's movements in the southern world. And I'm glad to say that we have had many connections with Egypt as well. I have also published some Egyptian writers, one of whom, Salwa Bakr, is in this room. She's sitting over there. We published a collection of her stories long ago. I want to talk to you a little bit about the developments in the women's movement and in women's situation that have taken place in India in the last, say, year and a half or 2 years, through an incident that I'm sure that you're all very familiar with, which made it to the world headlines, and that was the incident of the sexual violation, rape, and murder of a young woman, a young paramedical student in Delhi, in a bus in December of 2012. Shortly after this incident of violation, the young woman died, and the sexual violation and her murder or her death gave rise to a huge protest movement across India, which was very diverse in terms of its structure of class and gender and age and region, and a whole range of other things. And for us, this was the first time in India that what is usually known as the women's question brought a response from people who were not only women, but involved a lot of men, involved families, involved a whole range of other people. And as a result of that movement, a number of changes were set in motion, which have not, of course, had the widespread impact that change needs to have in order for it to really take root, but which have been very important starting points, and which provide us with some interesting parallels with what has been going on here in Egypt with the involvement of women in the revolution that you have had here in the past few years. Just as in Egypt, in India too, the public arena in the last few years has been largely dominated by women, and in claiming the public space, women have changed the character of that space. They have changed it into a space that they are claiming as their own, where they have every right to be, And having participated in that space politically and raised their voices, it's going to be very difficult to push them back into the four walls of the home. And I think that that's something that's going on here too. And also equally the participation of women in the revolution here in Egypt has helped to raise questions of human rights and women's citizenship, and they not necessarily women as the beneficiaries of welfare or women who can be given some little thing to make them happy and then the rest of it stays with the men, but the aggressive claiming of the public space and the aggressive claiming of women's rights as citizens and women's rights to be part of the change that will turn their country into what they want it to be is something that you have very effectively asserted here. And it is something that women's groups and the women's movement in India have been asserting for years, but the last year and a half has been particularly significant in that respect. So it was as a result of women's participation in the protest movements and their leadership of those movements in the last year and a half that the state took notice of what was happening, and the state acted to try and change some of the realities on the ground. The first thing that they did was to put in place a committee to look at what changes were needed, and we were all extremely skeptical of this committee because every time governments and states need to defer an issue, they set up an inquiry committee and the issue disappears from the public agenda. But in this case, it did not, which took us by surprise. And it forced women activists to collaborate with the committee, which was in the end an excellent thing, because over a long period, over a 30-day period when the committee functioned, women activists across the country sent in their recommendations for the kind of changes that they were looking for in the law on sexual violence, sexual assault, rape. And the committee not only took these recommendations on board, but they met with women's groups over a 2-day period to listen to their evidence, meeting with 27 groups who were selected from across the country by women activists themselves. And as a result of this, we had in place a new law on rape and on sexual assault, and following on that, 2 or 3 other new pieces of legislation, such as the legislation on sexual harassment at the workplace, which came about as a result of pressure put by women's groups and a petition filed by women's groups many years ago, such as the legislation on questions of homosexuality and transgenders, and a whole lot of other laws that came in. Of course, bringing in legislation is not the only answer to anything, but it was a very important step. We did not get everything that we had asked for, but we got at least 50% of it, which is a good step to make. Also, I think one of the other interesting things for us, and I'm not sure how that works for you here, I'd be very interested in knowing that, is that because India in the past few years has become such a hub of outsourced work for companies across the world, information technology companies, business processing companies, and so on, they rely a great deal on the labor of women. Women form a significant part of the workforce. And in Delhi, at least, the participation of women has gone up from 38% to about 50% in these companies. And the increasing discussions in the world media about India as an unsafe place for women, the perception of India as the representation of India as a place where women were not safe and where they were subjected to terrible violence, had a strong impact on these companies and the women workforce in the companies, which many women managers began to say they did not want to stay late at work. Many women employees said they wanted more safer forms of transport and they were considering leaving their jobs. And this was not a particularly good thing for companies to have to face, especially international companies which live, or which at least live, follow certain best practices in the way they employ people, the way they treat employees, in the diversity and in the inclusivity of those employees. Nor was it a good thing for the Indian government to be seen to be not doing anything for its women, and for this impact, this economic impact to take place, which could possibly take away a considerable source of revenue. So that was also something that women's groups leveraged in order to try and achieve the kind of change that they were fighting for. There is a lot of other stuff that I could talk about, but I'm not going to. This is just to give you a little bit of an example of the kinds of things that we are confronted with, some of the changes that we have been able to make. But of course, the problem of the status of women in India, like here, is a problem that does not only rest with the economic level or the level of legislation. There is a whole very deep-rooted culture of patriarchy. There is a whole very deep-rooted culture of belief in religion and the role that religion plays in people's lives and the ways in which religion reinforces and gives social sanction to patriarchal practices that we are having to battle. But the important thing is that there is a very, very strong movement against many of these issues, very diverse movement, which is also quite fragmented because there isn't a lot of unity on issues. But when there is a pan-Indian issue such as the recent one, then many groups come together to function together, and that helps to drive some change. So I will end just by saying, using a phrase that I used in an essay I wrote a while ago, and it is this: India is changing, just as Egypt is changing, and I think this phrase would be true for Egypt also, and at the heart of that change are its women. But people have not noticed that yet, and by the time they find out, it'll be too late because we'll have changed the world.
Thank you, Dr. Omnia. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation to be here. And thanks to my colleague, Italia, because as Omnia said, she's been touching upon certain points which echo very true in the Egyptian situation. I'll sort of build on what she's saying and at the same time speak from a slightly different perspective. I'll be speaking about patriarchy, but not in that sense. I'm speaking about patriarchy as a frame of mind. I'm speaking about patriarchy controlling both men and women. I'm speaking about patriarchy in the sense of how it reveals itself, not just in the political sphere, but also in the social and the religious. We know what patriarchy is, but the news, as Botalia says, the news patriarchy hasn't heard of yet, is that something very serious has been happening in the last 9 and 10 years. So it's not just the 3 years of the Egyptian revolution, it's more than that. Since the beginning of the millennium, there has been a lot of resistance, social resistance revealed in the protests as well as in how women are re-perceiving themselves, seeing themselves from a different perspective. And the sexual harassment of women that took place in front of the, in downtown Cairo, it wasn't just in front of the journalist syndicate in 2005, raised a similar wave of protests among the people. So it's no longer the elite, it's no longer the artists, it's no longer the development people, it's now the people who are involved, both men and women. So this is only an introduction to what I believe was happening in the last few years. And what was happening is that something in the collective psyche was changing in the last 10 years. But we did not realize that. I did not realize the transformation except in January 2011. And you cannot perceive and realize psychological transformation except when they manifest themselves in action, right? So speaking of the collective psyche and citing the example of the Tahrir utopia, as many Egyptians have described it, what I'm saying is that at that time, a whole new set of feminine values were asserting themselves. Such values, like for example, the spirit of acceptance of others, the tenderness, the embrace of people among strangers, on the streets, the state of how we took it upon ourselves to protect ourselves, our homes, during the early days of the revolution, and of course the presence of women down the streets, the sacrifices of the women who were not on the streets, like all the women who contributed to the revolution without being physically there, whether by financial support or by giving their children to death. And this, in addition to the last item, which is an explanation of what those feminine values are, is the artistic surge that was felt and seen, again, not just during the revolution, but it was preparing itself, and it was there since the early years of the millennium. Such values suddenly revealed themselves, and we Egyptians started seeing ourselves from a completely different perspective. So it was no longer the image created by the regime of who you are, but it's now a different image. That fabricated image, which has been carefully made over decades, has fallen to pieces, and we've come to see ourselves afresh. We've come to see ourselves away from the lies of the political regime. So I see the manifestation of such feminine values in the last few years. When this took place in 2011, I could not but give it the name of a phoenix. So it was a being, very difficult to define, very difficult to draw, but it was a being that was revealing itself through the men and women down the streets crying justice and dignity and freedom. So you can imagine, of course, the backlash of patriarchy. The political and the religious patriarchy backlashed. And the political regime took it upon itself to humiliate women, to try to drive them away from the streets, and all the things that we already know which took place since actually 2005, but again very clearly in 2011, 12, and 13. Now, I'm just sharing with you an idea that has been developing in my mind for the last 3 years. This battle, ongoing and very hot, between the patriarch on the one hand, and the patriarch is not a person. I have to say this again. The patriarch is a mindset. So the battle that has been going on between the patriarch on the one hand and this incredible, amazing phoenix on the other hand, and what we can do about it. We as people, the people, not just the artists, but the intellectual activists, the cultural activists, the artists, and the ordinary people who were there and who are still there. What can we do about that? I think what we can do about that is, number one, define where we stand in this battle. So which side are we with? And according to this realization of where we stand in this battle, we need to, if you belong to the camp of the phoenix, if you belong to the camp of the feminine values, we need to give all the support we can to such spirit, to such new image of who we are, because the collective consciousness, I'm again speaking about the collective psyche would never be able to balance itself and to be whole and healthy if the feminine is suppressed, if the feminine stays suppressed. It has been suppressed for decades. Very few people, men and women, struggling, leading a feminist battle, and so on. But lately, masses of people have joined that fight, that battle. And whether you know it or not, you are part of it. If you're being manipulated by the system, if your brain is being washed by the politicians and the media, you are part of what's happening in a negative way. And if you are aware of what's happening and you are siding with what the feminine values are, then you need to do whatever you can, either by the simple realization of this is where I stand and this is what I believe in. The world needs to be whole again. The world needs to be male and female, but not patriarchal in any sense. If I stand in this camp, I will do whatever I can to speak of the idea, to support the arts, support artists, not just independent groups and people who are really passionate about what they're doing, but also, I mean, the people who were down the streets and who were improvising and singing and doing theater and doing all that. So anyways, this is a very brief and abridged idea of something that has been on my mind for the last 3 years. And I do believe very much, as you just said, I share with you the belief that the feminine will be winning, because the feminine means life and life-giving. It doesn't mean war, it doesn't mean violence, it doesn't mean hierarchy. It means an all-embracing spirit of a world where we can exist, men and women, and accept ourselves first, and accept the others. Thank you.